I just want to welcome everybody. We have an incredibly distinguished panel here that I will introduce a little bit later. But just wanted to welcome everybody attending. And the hosts are going to be myself, John Sains. I lead the global HR practice for DHR Global. Heather Smith was in our CEO and board practice, and Andrea Henderson, who is in several practices, including the HR practice. So with that, Heather, would you like to kick off the data?
Sure. Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. I'll set the stage for what inspired today's webinar with some insights from our board and CEO practice. And we'll see here some of the insights that we've seen in executive search in placing board directors, and what's going on in and around the boardroom has been an increase really of HR presence in the boardroom in three key areas. HR is reporting more often into the boardroom during board meetings. HR is involved in board director recruitment. This is relatively new. Typically the board handles their own recruiting separate from HR. And in today's environment, we've seen HR become more involved in director recruitment. And thirdly, HR skills are becoming more desirable in the boardroom, which we'll talk about at length today. We can switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. Interestingly enough, we're talking today about HR talent in the boardroom, but the statistics really are not supporting yet that there's much HR experience in the boardroom yet. We believe this trend will continue to increase. Looking at the Russell 3000, only a little over 1% of new directors in 2020 were brought on with CHRO experience. In 2022, we saw a little bit of an increase. Just under 3% of new directors had CHRO experience. Still pretty small numbers in the wider boardroom recruitment of the HR requirement. ISS, which is the Institutional Shareholder Services, also reported from the S&P 500 over those same 2 years. This experience was a little more surprising, reporting that 11% of all directors in the S&P 500 had brought HR experience into their board seat. By 2022, they reported 20%. Diving into these numbers, really the HR experience is not necessarily from an HR officer or a CHRO. It can be more widely interpreted. A CEO may have HR experience. Anyone who's managed people in the past could be reported as having HR experience. The important thing to note is that this is being recorded and followed as HR experience needed in the boardroom, regardless of who it's coming from. So important trends to watch, or broadly as well, speak to the fact that likely HR skills will continue to be recruited into board seats. Talent management and the war for talent is a top board agenda today and is expected to continue in 2024 and beyond. Corporate leadership and good governance best practices are a boardroom topic today. Certainly culture and DEI&B remain a topic on the boardroom agenda, and then executive compensation and succession planning. All of these point to long-term success and shareholder value. They will remain on boardroom agendas and fall into the HR skill set that likely will be required going forward. And then today we'll talk a little bit more about the HR skills that are required. So it's not only about recruiting a CHRO or an HR officer to the boardroom, it's really about what's going on within the company, what skills are required in the boardroom, and whom in the C-suite or in the corporate environment brings these skills to the table to round out the board's skills. A couple of things to think about beyond succession planning and some of the obvious HR skills that you all bring to the table. There are other skills, 5 listed here, and we'll hear from our panelists about their skills and how they're using them in the boardroom today. Collaborating with other executives and developing business strategy is a very big piece of what boards are looking for, and often what an HR senior seasoned HR executive brings to the table. HR executives are also adept at balancing employee well-being and corporate interests. They know how to translate strategy into actionable plans. Most importantly, they manage relationships and communications across various stakeholders. This is a very important skill set that often, again, boards are looking for in today's environment. And then finally, managing organizational change. Of course, it depends on the company's point of where they are in their trajectory and what they have ahead in their future, but organizational change has been and will remain a very important boardroom topic, including M&A, issues like bankruptcy, moving from private to public or from public back to private, considering a transaction. Many of these types of changes HR leaders have led companies through in the past, and that becomes an important skill set that you all bring to the table as a potential board director. So with that, we'll set the stage a bit for why we are having this conversation today, and I'll look back to John to introduce our panelists and get on with the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heather. So it's my great honor to introduce the distinguished panel today. First is my dear friend, Amy Cappellanti-Wolf. Amy is an accomplished CHRO and global human resource executive, business transformer, and coach with expertise in human capital management, culture creation, and leadership development. Amy worked with startups up to Fortune 500 companies, including senior roles at Cohesity, Symantec, Cisco, Sun Microsystems, Disney, and Frito-Lay/PepsiCo, which is where I work with her. Amy serves on 2 boards today, Soft Choice, New York Stock Exchange listed public company, IT managed service provider, and D-Wave, a public quantum computing company. She also serves as chairman of the compensation committee and as a member of the nomination and governance committee for these 2 public boards. Amy is also a board member for Better Work, a performance management platform company. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Next is Deb Grant. Deb is an independent director, visionary strategist, frequent keynote speaker, executive coach, and one of the country's foremost experts in leadership, diversity, and inclusion. After retiring from a 30-year career in corporate America, she launched Corporate Playbook, which enables the advancement of high-impact leaders, and she launched Dining with Deb, which engages professional women across the country. Deb is currently chair of the Human Capital and Compensation Committees at Sound Thinking, a NASDAQ-listed company, and a director at DJE Holdings. Welcome, Deb. Our next panelist is Kaye Foster. Kaye is a highly respected board chair, venture partner, and former corporate leader with 20 years of experience engaging with executives at global corporations like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. In addition to her current role as senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group, Kaye serves on the boards of 2 public companies, advisory board of Collective Health and Waymark, and advisor to the CEO of Upside Foods. A champion of the EIB and ESG, she researches, writes, and speaks about its connections to driving sustainable and value-creating innovation. Welcome, Kaye. And last but not least, please welcome Mike Philman, also a good friend of mine. Mike is EVP and CHRO of Albertsons Companies. He is celebrated for his people-first approach and customer-centric philosophy, bringing over 3 decades of HR experience across prominent companies like PepsiCo and Yum, who work together. His leadership extends beyond corporate roles, contributing to various boards and advisory positions, reflecting his commitment to fostering employee well-being and organizational growth. Welcome, Mike. We're incredibly fortunate to have this amazing panel at our webinar today. We're going to start with some questions for the panel and audience. If you have questions as we have the conversation, please add them to the Q&A section, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible.
Thank you for introducing our esteemed panelists, John. So the first question is for Amy. As a former global CHRO with experience leading organizations of various sizes and financial structures, from the startups to Fortune 500, what can you tell us about serving on various types of boards, such as private, venture, private equity, founder-backed, public, and nonprofit boards? Can you share a little bit about your experience and the skills that are best suited for each based on the organization type?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here today. I think sometimes people don't know there are so many flavors of board service, and I think it's really important to understand those, because some will allow you to bring your expertise earlier into the maturity curve, whereby others might want to have you join later from a scale perspective. But I would add a couple of things. There's ways of thinking about being in a private equity-backed board. I've served on that type of conundrum before, and also went public with that board. So typically private equity boards are really about what is the best value we can derive from this business. And there's two flavors of PE firms. There's the ones that really want to be operational with you and really help you grow and accrete your business. And there are others that are about value capture and synergies and maybe extracting as much as you can. So it's good for the PE firm and potentially not always as good for the employees or the management team. There's also boards where, and typically PE boards initially when they're formed are really focused on CEOs joining, heads of product go to market, and very often heads of HR that would be serving as boards are typically added maybe later in the process. And I would say the same thing for venture capitalist boards. And venture capitalist boards are backed boards are really focused on how do we get this company ready to either sell or to grow, to take to a public market. And so how do you have the right kind of oversight to help that founder or that CEO really grow their business? And again, when they're private, I've come to find that very often you join that VC-backed firm when you are as a head of HR or have HR experience later in their maturity curve before they go public. And for those instances, you're really helping with governance, talent management, and expertise related to going public and sustainability and growth in the business. The one that's probably most obvious is public company roles, which has a lot more skin in the game for you. All of these require you to have responsibility and also liability to decisions that you might make as a board. But in public forums, it's even more so because of the disclosures and how you think about playing a role there. And I find the public boards are more about sort of you're really bringing your real commercial expertise, having led HR organizations or worked at the C-suite level before. And then the last one, of course, is nonprofit, which feeds our souls. And hopefully the other boards do as well. But nonprofits, I find, are also looking for people who are great at fundraising, who can connect with the mission of the nonprofit and connect communities into that nonprofit. So there's lots of different flavors of boards. And I think what you have to think about is, if you've worked in PE before, does that attract you? It's a whole different value proposition. If you work with venture capitalists, there's obviously risk to that as well, as companies need funding, and the debt right now is very expensive to raise. So how do you think about your role in those types of organizations? And of course, public's probably more aligned to those who've served as public CHROs. But the single most important thing in all of those is they're looking for commercial leaders. I enter into the role as a board member as a business leader first, and person who has HR and human capital expertise second. And so really understanding how the business works, the business model, the customers, the competitors, the profit margins, if you're an EBITDA business, how to think about the financial impacts of decisions being made, et cetera. Those actually open the doors for you to be considered for board positions. And they also really add to your ability to have impact in the boardroom, because you understand the business and therefore can translate what are the kind of governance things you should be thinking about related to human capital metrics or workforce planning or diversity, equity, inclusion, or cost optimizations, et cetera. So there's different types to consider serving on, and not all boards are similar or alike. You have to really understand what value you can bring to that board, and where you also will have a chance to contribute and build your experience as well.
Great, thank you. That's a very
Andrea,
thorough answer.
Andrea, if I may, So I think, Amy, one of the insights that you offer that I really hope that the audience takes away is, I often tell people who are interested in joining boards, start thinking about that in the job that you're in. So the way you just described approaching, even if you are a sitting CHRO, approaching your job as a business leader and really understanding the drivers of the business, understanding how the external and the internal marketplace impacts the decisions that you make. So the ability to, even in your job, start really thinking about what is the role of a board director, because quite frankly, you have the opportunity to start learning some of those skills and start to really be much more, I would say, much more compelling as a candidate when you are then looking for board roles. Because so often when I talk with folks, when I speak with folks who are looking to become board candidates, they think about it when they are looking for board candidates. And I say you're missing a huge opportunity to really develop that muscle in the job that you're in right now. So thank you very much for saying that. I think it was very, very prescient.
I agree with you 100%. Start, be the future, be the change you want to be. And it starts with how you show up as an operating executive, and then how you take that into the boardroom.
That's great. Thank you. So the next question is for Deb. A trailblazing career GE executive with HR and CEO leadership experience has provided you with a multitude of skill sets. What is your key value proposition to the boardroom? Describe the skills needed to serve on the various committees you serve: comp chair, nominating, and governance member.
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. It's an honor to participate in this session. And thank you for the kind words. You know, I start this conversation coming from the old adage around board service, which is board service, your eyes are in and your fingers are out. Eyes are in, fingers are out. So you have to think about this as an HR leader in a different way, because you're not being looked at to or expected to, or the skill set they're looking to bring you onto the board for is your ability to implement, your ability to execute. It's really going to be much more around your strategic ability. The skills that I frame, and I think you all do this, a lot of the question is the framing. How do you frame it to set yourself up to get into that board interview conversation? So for me, it was framing myself, having worked for a multinational global conglomerate, is having a broad array of skills, competencies, and experiences in multiple industries. It was framing being an analytical thinker or a critical thinker. So again, not necessarily this is what I did, which is what you would do to interview for a job, but how did I approach this in terms of my analysis, giving examples of being an analytical thinker, a critical thinker. Other skills that I spoke to, I would speak to, are the ability to communicate and to persuade. Because when you're in board discussions or deliberations, you've got to be able to really defend your point of view and why you have that point of view, and potentially persuade others. I mean, if you're thinking about the strategy the company's going to go, and maybe you've seen an experience where a company or a business unit has gone that way before, here's why I think we should do this and why, or here's why I really think we shouldn't do it and why. So communication, persuasion, again, things that you do, but again, it's the framing. Your leadership, your ability to lead. And I'm just building on what Amy has said. I agree with what Amy said wholeheartedly, but it's also, a board is a team. It is a team. And so are you a team player? Because a lot of times when you get into these conversations, it's going to be about fit. We know you can do this because of the job that you're doing, but how do you fit in with the board members that we have? Think succession planning. For the committees that I chair comp, which we recently just changed to human capital and comp, this on human capital that we've talked about. But the succession planning for the board, that's Nom and Gov, who else do we need with skill sets, but also succession planning for the CEO and the very senior leadership team, and how that team looks as a group, how they complement each other. And then the last thing I would add at this point is, for me, it was having seen business cycles, business ups, business downs, because boards now, particularly those that are necessarily in startup mode, it's growth, 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 growth. But at some point you may hit a wall. Oh, wow. So now what do? We've scaled. So now what? And so the ability to say, yeah, I've had some exposure and experience with all of those things. But again, go back to that, eyes in, fingers out. And how do you sort of kick your skill set, competencies, experiences up a level beyond implementing, your team implementing, to how do I really help us think about all of this strategically and where the company should go?
Hey, Deb, quick question for you, if you don't mind me jumping in. Do you think it's also important to understand board composition? Now I know we all should be around supporting and driving value for the shareholder, but an independent director has a different perspective than potentially an investor.
Yes.
And so how do you think about that dynamic? Because you got to work amongst all of them. So how have you been able to sort of unwrap, like, how do I influence this person perhaps differently than I might have to influence this person on the board?
Yeah, and I didn't share. I was on a private equity board that was the company was sold. So I was one of the independent directors that the founder had 4 spots, and then the investors had other spots. So I was one of the founders' spots. So I was a little more independent than the others. I think you just have to do what's right. Again, this is coming back to that influence and persuasion. Here's what I've seen. Here's what I've observed. Here's what I've noticed in my work and lived experience, and why I think this is right for us if we're trying to grow, if we're trying to do this. I think and sometimes, you got to really understand any kind of, meeting dynamics, right? Sometimes you got to meet with people one-on-one, the meeting before the meeting. I mean, that's a whole nother seminar, I think. But it's really understanding, I'll say boardroom dynamics, but it's just meeting dynamics in general. That's what I found to be effective.
Amy, let me just pull your thread a little bit on the venture side. So I was asked to join a board that was all investors, some of them offshore, some of them onshore, but the CEO's advisory group, if you want to think about your board that way, we're all investors. And some investors want to get in and get out and make a buck quickly. Some are in it for the longer term. Some are thinking about, how does this company go public? And so when the CEO is the one that asked me to join his board, I said, I want to talk to every single one of your board members. Mm-hmm. And I want to understand what they're looking for that they think would be additive to the board, because right now it's kind of you versus them. I don't think it's helpful for it's you and me versus them. I think it's got to be, we're all in the same group together trying to build a company. And so it was really interesting and insightful as I talked to each of the board members. They realized they needed some people on the board with outside skills that they didn't have, which is kind of what Kaye, you've just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, Andrea. Let me just, because again, I'm going to pull that thread with you, John, because Mike, because increasingly, this is where I'm starting to see more openness, particularly on the venture side, more openness around people who bring this breadth of talent, human capital experience. Because if you think about just the art to value of many of these companies, it's a longer time frame.
Yeah.
So in the old days, quote unquote, you were looking for a quick flip. And that just is not the case anymore, that many of these companies have got to be held. The capital markets don't support it. Financing is difficult. Getting, as you said, Amy, getting the product roadmap to actually to be executed and implemented. Those things are much more complex than before. So, Andrea, some of the statistics that your colleagues highlighted that indicate more interest in the human capital expertise space, my hypothesis is directly related to that. It's no longer the quick flip, but the recognition, and I'll talk a little bit about that, the recognition that these dynamics, these dimensions actually are really value creation levers that we haven't necessarily always pulled as effectively in the past.
Yeah, because we have to be sure there's actually people who can run the business if we need to run the business longer than anticipated several years ago, to your point, Kaye.
Exactly.
That leads me to the next question about how you start these conversations. So, Kaye, as a venture partner and a board director in a publicly traded company, and several private company boards as well, how were you able to leverage your your HR operator experience initially to get that first board role? That's a question that some folks have asked in the chat as well. How did you leverage that operator experience to show up as a board member?
So a couple of different ways. One of the things we haven't talked about is also doing some of the, I think you approach your board journey from the same level of rigor and discipline that you approach everything else. And, you know, a couple of years ago, there were almost, as a matter of fact, when I was at J&J, we actually had a stated policy that none of our corporate executives could serve on boards. And it was really this view that what was required to actually be a director, particularly on public companies, not just from a risk perspective, but just the amount of work that's required to be a director. I think what has happened over time is the recognition that you actually have real value, not just to bring to the public boards, but to bring back to your own role, because it gives you a bit of an outside in. So for me, that first board role came as a result of, no surprise to anyone here, from interacting with the directors on the company that I was the CHRO at, because they had an opportunity. I worked very closely with the chair of the comp committee, worked very closely with the chair of the Nom and Gov committee, and I was in the boardroom in those meetings because the company was just going through significant transformation. So the ability to really show up, to your point, Deb, not just as the HR operating executive, but as a leader who had an enterprise view, as a leader who had a hypothesis around value creation. As a matter of fact, one of the ways in which I talked about talent and continue to talk about talent, particularly in the pharma and biotech development space, I really talk about how do you shorten the time under the curve. So if it takes 7 to 10 years on average to develop a drug from discovery to patient, if we could shrink that by a year, there is quantifiable value, right? We can tell you not just how many patients' lives are either saved or transformed, we can tell you what's the economic value of that. And I was able to talk about the fact that talent, leadership, culture, that those are the levers that we can actually pull. It's kind of what Deb said. You need the people, you need the scientists, you need the key talent. Amy, you talked about AI and quantum computing. That is a huge accelerant in drug discovery and drug development. So the ability to really link what we do to talent, I was doing that as a CHRO, and I was talking about and arguing for economic value creation. And that's what created that opportunity certainly for me, and I'll invite my colleagues to offer their perspective, but that's where the interest and the anchor really became, because I was a practitioner and people saw the viability for a board member in that regard.
Excellent. Anyone else want to add to that? I know that was a lot.
Yeah, I'm gonna build on Kaye. I think Kaye's spot on. So I think sometimes we're put in a box of, well, they're HR, so they're gonna help us with culture, DE&I, engagement, which are certainly very important, don't get me wrong. But I also think there's a full spectrum of other things we can influence. So I think about things like, material costs around what's your replacement cost in terms of your attrition rates? Are you finding that you have pay differentials that are, causing internal equity and parity concerns? You think about supply chain issues and whether or not that supply chain concern will actually have an impact on the human capital ability, measurements around productivity, the ability to deliver upon, cost initiatives. Reputational impact. There's a lot related to employee value proposition and how we can advise on that, in addition to consumer perspectives on whether it's B2B or B2C companies. How are we looking as a trusted partner as a company related to those types of cohorts? There's ESG, which is everything from your DEI programs, how you think about governance and adherence. So there's so many different vectors in which we can actually create value and consult and advise. And I think we limit ourselves sometimes because perhaps we're not confident enough to say that we can actually add value in things that are brought beyond what I just described in the previous example. But there's so many ways we can influence and make a change that I think are business and people related.
Amy, let me just add, I agree with your list. I would just also add the most important thing that a board does is does CEO succession. And if you
Yeah.
can bring excellence to that process, because I can tell you some boards know what they're doing, they've got a recipe, they've been through it in other boards, but most aren't. Most of them are lost. They don't know where to start. They don't know when to start. They should start the day after they hired their last CEO. And I think bringing excellence to that process will get you in the mindsets of your board members, because a lot of board seats end up getting referred from board members.
Exactly.
Right.
I think
And
open
so
AI
I
could
think
be
if you
used
can bring
for
your
hiring.
excellence to that process and be their shepherd and guide, it says a lot to your capabilities.
Let me add something very simple. This is going to sound overly simplistic, but in terms of this audience, it will make all the sense in the world. Sometimes it's just the ability to assess and evaluate. Assess and evaluate a person, a candidate for the board or for the CEO. Most people, you all know this, most people cannot interview well. They don't know what to ask. They don't know what they're looking at. So even if we can help and I'm building on sort of what you said, Mike, frame a process around how do I know what I'm looking at when I'm looking at board candidates or a CEO candidate? How do I assess that? How do I rate that versus what we need? Most people cannot do that. Now, HR folks can, good HR folks can. That's a real value add, building on your point, Mike, for the CEO. And I will say, as you may be asked to meet the executive leadership team, depending on the size of the business.
That's a great segue to my next question. And the next question is for Mike. Mike, you're an incredibly busy CHRO of Albertsons, a $77 billion company that's actually going through a merger with almost 300,000 employees. How do you balance the role of executive and board member?
Yeah, I don't know if balance is a good word for me. I think having been a CHRO, this is my third rodeo, all in big companies. So I kind of understand where the business needs me to lean into things and where I develop my team to actually pick those things up and run with them. And I think if you've got a world-class team that you're alongside of, it opens up some doors. I think the other part of it is, John, is I took a 5-year siesta from corporate America. I've been involved in boardrooms since 1991, so it's been a while. But I think I took an exit to learn the other side. I kind of figured out at that point I'd been in corporate America for 25 years. I thought there's got to be another angle that I need to learn, and so that I ended up going into venture. Right, started a fund with a friend from New York and got involved, and I learned so much stuff in venture that I could bring to my corporate environment. So I stayed out of corporate America for 5.5 years. And I think it made me a better HR executive, and I think it made me a better business executive. And so the balance part is, you tend to work on things that are interesting and help you learn, right? And yeah, I'm still learning in my corporate jobs. I haven't been on this side of a deal before. I haven't been on the acquired side before. I've been on all the other sides, including activists and all the rest. But I think you make time for the things that are interesting to you, and it doesn't take all my time by any means. I got plenty to do in my day job, especially with the merger and all the stuff that goes with that. But I find that I learn a lot, and it helps me contribute even more internally.
Others?
Well, I mean, I think to your point, we are our best selves when we have a diversity of perspective, right? And when you sit in the other people's shoes. And I know in the past, I've been an operating CHRO, and I've sat across some boards that were really well and high functioning and others that weren't so much. So I took that perspective into how I think about my role on a board, about if I was an operator, what would be the best guidance I could get from this board for me to be successful? And that goes back to, what is it, your fingers out, or fingers in, nose out, or whatever
eyes in, fingers out.
Eyes
out, yeah, fingers out. So, to transition from doing to advising sometimes can be challenging. But at the same time, we have to understand, like, we are there to look around the corner, right? We've been here before. We know how things potentially could play out. So how do we take all those years of experience? And to Mike's point, how do you get other, dimensional views of how you would operate as a board member. It's not just I was HR the entire career, so I only bring that particular expertise to the table. So I think it's incumbent on you and us, if you want to really be considered for board opportunities, you have to bring a diversity of experience and perspective into the room for sure.
Yeah. To that point, I've run stores, I've run supply chain, but I think to the group, I think a lot of them have questions on how they should go about it. I see some of the things in the chat. What I've found is, I get reached out to by people just like everybody on this panel does to say, hey, could you help me on X? And unless if I don't know that space and I can't be helpful, I'll say, let me connect you to Amy, let me connect you to somebody else.
100%.
But just if you help other people, right, with an issue, solve a problem, give them some thinking, point them in the right direction, get them connected, you start to build this network. And I think that's how these things kind of happen, especially in the venture space, is they're looking for people that have connections, have breadth of experiences, kind of see the world in a different way, as opposed to, hey, I'm looking for a director with this exact skill set. They don't tend to look, at least in the venture space, and having been in public companies, and I've done a lot of board searches in the companies I've been part of with their board chair. You're usually looking for somebody that's got the right mindset and some experiences, less so a bunch of skill sets. You're looking for some people that have experiences. So like, hey, we got an activist that's come in. It would be really good to have our next board member have experience dealing with an activist, if nobody else in the room's got it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The other thing I would say, and again, a couple of things in the chat talked about the network, and you touched on that, Mike. One of the things I find is that people don't necessarily really leverage their network. You may have, you think about, I'll call it network level 1. You don't go down level 2, level 3, and you don't really think about the breadth. I mean, what I actually did, literally, I sat down with my iPhone and I literally started scrolling through it, like while I was watching television, literally, and created a spreadsheet. Okay, who do I know who could be helpful? Because I thought about a bunch of people initially that, oh, this person's a CEO, or they're this, or they're that. Then there were these other people. There was a person who was the father of one of my daughter's friends, who is a CEO, who I hadn't thought about because he wasn't necessarily in my professional circle, but he certainly knew me well enough to take my call and take a meeting to say, hey, I'm looking at board service, would love to sit down with you. So I would say, don't underestimate the breadth of your network, the person you're on a nonprofit board with, the person you volunteer with, all of those people. Just think about who may know who, and then be very methodical about it. You got to be methodical about who you talk to, what they said, what the follow-up is. And again, this is the old adage of a salesperson, you got to ask for the order. And I will just have to say this quite bluntly, as a Black female, my observation was, with a few white men, I said, I'm looking at board service, they said, oh, well, you would be great. But I never thought about you that way.
Yeah.
So until I articulated, this is what I'm looking for, they never made the assumption. Now, once I said it, they went, oh yeah, well, you've done this, you've done that. You'd be great. Let me see how I can help you. But I had to actually say it.
So I'm going to pick up from your point, Deb, because I think you're getting into a point that I made at the beginning, that you have to approach this with a level of rigor and discipline. Mm-hmm. And as long as I've been serving on boards across all kinds of boards, I am still on the journey of education. So I'm a firm believer in things like the NACD. I went through their governance fellowship program. I go to their webinars. To your point around the network, people, people, and you get to know what is also evolving in terms of whether it's governance, whether it's issues, but you have to connect yourself to the ecosystem that you're trying to be a part of. And there are ways you can do that without sitting on a board. And there are all kinds of programs that are available that, not just from the education perspective, but also gets you connected to a registry and a network of potential board candidates. There was also, Andrea, I noticed in the chat, a question about sitting on college boards and whether or not that was not relevant, but the value of doing that. I've been a trustee on the Spelman College board going on a decade now. This is my third term. And what's interesting, it's less about being on a college board. It's in the midst of the conversation we're having. Shared governance is a critical issue on college boards. No different than governance. The context is different, but there's still governance that's required. And your point, Deb, about nose or eyes in and fingers out still applies. Students are customers, right? Just think about all of the legal and regulatory and all the complexity of the issues that they're dealing with, which requires a level of way more sophistication. This isn't anymore, the person who's the trustee for the last 50 years. The issues that we are wrestling with are extremely contemporary to some of the issues that we are dealing with on public boards and others. So therefore, to me, if you're building that portfolio of experiences, skills, networks, when I think about the people that sit across from the Spelman board with me. So I really want to encourage people not to get so focused on, I got to be on a public company board. It's what are the sets of experiences, skills, expertise, network? How am I going to thread the needle with that journey and think about it as a journey? I'm not a Spelman College alum, so it isn't even that you have to be an alum to be on the board. And so I encourage people to think about their board journey as a portfolio. So I do sit on venture. I'm a venture partner. I do sit on private and public company boards. I serve on executive advisory boards, which sometimes people don't even think about that. But again, the point is, how are you really building that composite of experience, skills, expertise, and to Deb's point, your network that allows you then to really leverage ultimately what you're looking for.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing, you hit the nail on the head. I always believe, I've told this to many people, and it was taught to me early on, that you apply for credit when you don't need it. So let's say you're a student and you need a credit card, do it when your credit's really good, because when you need it and it's not good, you're not going to get that support. Same thing for connecting. Always make it a part of your discipline about staying connected, making new connections, because very often, sometimes, back to what Deb was saying, sometimes people don't even know your interest levels, or they don't even know about you. But if you're top of mind for people because you've cultivated a relationship, you've helped them when they need help, or you've added value to them in some shape or form, that's going to bode well for you for the future. So don't ever say, and we've all done it, I'm too busy, I don't have time to network, I got to get down, I got to do my tactics to get my job done. It pays you back in spades if you can make that a regular part of how you operate as an executive and leader.
Yes. It actually will bring more value to your job as well, to the job you're in, because you're going to learn more that way.
Exactly.
Absolutely. You're going to get best practices from lots of different places, to your point, Mike. Yes.
So wonderful conversation. I love where you're heading with all the different topics around adding business value, networking, that kind of thing. But if you want to simplify it for people that are just starting the journey, what are the 1, 2, or maybe 3 things you can advise them to start thinking about? Anyone?
What I'll start off, and I'll just give one. Passion. Like, what do you really have interest in that you could really add value to serve, because it's something you have a personal passion for? And that could be, hey, I know software as a service, I know how to transform and build businesses, and so that's an obvious one for me. But personally, I'm very athletic. I perform a lot of sports, and so, gosh, wouldn't it be fun to work for an athletic, medical device company that allows me to juxtaposition my experience in technology, but also my passion for health and fitness, for example. So I would say, just get clear about what are the things you really love, because if you join a board and you don't love it, it's not much fun and you're not going to be very effective.
Yeah, I mean, I usually ask people to do 2 things. One is, and it's a little bit tied to what you said, Amy, why do you want to be on a board? Be really honest with yourself. Some people think the economics, I'm going to retire and that's going to be kind of, my economic stream post-retirement. What I say to people, the reality of how hard and how many hours and how challenging board jobs are now, it's probably like working for McDonald's on any good day. So, but again, my point, I'm being facetious, but my point is, I think you have to be really honest with yourself. Is it about prestige? Is it about reputation? Just be honest with yourself. Like you said, Amy, is it because I'm passionate about something? Be honest with yourself about why you want to be on a board. And then the second is get a professional board bio. I can tell you that when people reach out to me and said, love to talk with you about being on a board, and I say to them, you know, if you have something ready, let's take a look at it. It is all over the spectrum. And it doesn't mean that you have to pay a professional to do it, but it certainly means you have to put in back to the time and the effort to be really clear about what is the value that you believe that you can add to any board, and therefore how are you dimensionalizing that? It's not your resume, it's not your LinkedIn profile, right? So it's, I would say those two things: be really honest with yourself about why you want to be on a board, and then put some rigor around really putting together a board profile.
I would say, if I could add and to build on that, I would say talk to people who are on boards and who've been on boards for a while. I find that we are very comfortable talking with peers, so people who are also looking like you are looking. And I find you get real information from people who actually have done it. So make sure that you just, ask questions. What is this like? How often do boards typically meet? What does the comp package look like? If it's venture, if it's private equity, it's going to be more equity versus cash. If I'm on a family-owned board, which is all cash. I mean, so you need to at least, if that's a factor for you, understand what the balance or trade-offs are. But I would say just literally sit down and engage several people who are on boards in deep conversations about it, what's it like, and get all of your questions answered. Then I think you can do a lot of what Kaye and Amy were saying, is you can kind of lay out to say, well, this is really what I'm looking for. I'm passionate about this, and it kind of fits these specs, and it gives you a sense of where to go forward.
I would just add to that, which is all great. When you're talking to board members, what's the part of the role they don't like? What's the part that just they get frustrated by? If they never had to do it again, it'd be too soon. I mean, there are parts of board roles that are, not cool, not hip, not fun.
Sucky, I think, is the word that comes to mind.
Right. No, those are great insights. Thank you so much. I want to transition to allow the audience to ask some questions, and we're going to pull forward a few questions that have come in from the chat. One of them is, isn't it wise for every board candidate to emphasize their skills in CEO succession planning, given the amount of CEO turnover in recent years?
Yes. Quite simply, the one thing I would say, however, is our role is also about what do you really need in the next CEO? Because we tend to sort of autopilot and just backfill that same capability. So you might be a sales-oriented business, but you need to really have innovation around your product roadmap. So you might want a different CEO in that instance, or someone that has to do some huge cost takeouts or optimizations. So you want someone who really understands the trade-off and balancing. And I think sometimes it's super easy just to say, oh, they're the named successor, or we'll just go hire this person without first having that discussion. I think we can add a lot of value in that, because we do ask those provocative questions about where's the business going in 5 years or 2 years, knowing that the development cycles are far shorter and faster. And what does that yield itself in terms of capabilities at the top that you don't perhaps need today, but will need in the future?
Let me just build on that, Amy. So if you think about the world in 2019, and you think about the world today, they're very different worlds. And we've all been through a lot of turmoil and chaos and all the rest. So I think about that as the CEO success profile, and it could change by the year. Be that person that connects with the board chair or whoever's going to run a process, or whoever owns it on the board. But I would probably start with the chair and say, I've been thinking about this from the chair I sit in, organizational health, HR, et cetera, and I've put together an outline of what a CEO succession, a a success profile should look like, and I'd be glad to work with you or hand it off to you. But be that person that leans in as opposed to waiting for the work order to come from one of your board members.
The only thing I would add, I agree with what both Mike and Amy said, is that yes, the board is responsible for CEO succession, but the CEO does not operate in a vacuum. So I do think there are other key senior leadership roles, depending on the company. It might be the CFO, it might be the chief technology officer, that you at least need to, as a board, have a conversation around. Well, if this person leaves, what are these person's skill sets and how do they match up? It's almost that chessboard, if you will. So I do think your ability as an HR leader, having done that presumably in your organization, can really bode well if you help the board just think about, we were looking at the CEO, but wow, if the CFO is going to retire in a couple of years as well, maybe we should think about how all of that plays out and in what time frame.
Absolutely. Great point. So there was another question about what is the demographics of companies looking to fill board seats with HR executive experience, industry, size, etc. Heather, do you want to start by sharing some of your?
Sure. I would just say, primarily it's across the board, as you've seen, I think, from these panelists. It's VC to large public companies needing the skill sets that the HR executive brings. And so I would say it's not limiting to any one sector, certainly where there are major transformations going on and growth, where talent may be a bigger issue in some sectors, or major transformation, such as industrial or certainly the automotive industry. We're seeing a lot of that at DHR. There's probably more, it's more realized that these skills can come from an HR executive, but I wouldn't limit it to any one size or sector, as you can see from this panel. Anyone else?
I think it almost goes back to what Amy said. Define what your passion is. Where do you want to play, right? And what space do you want to own? And then figure out how to tackle that space.
There's another question that sort of referenced how board service makes you a better HR operator. How does it help you? I know several of you have retired, but at some point, was there overlap where you were actually serving on the board and in an operating role? And how did the board role help you become a better HR leader?
Hey, I'll just give you my view. So, for example, if you think about how tech companies, which are most venture companies have a tech underlying, right, to them, right? That's just the nature of Silicon Valley. I now run my HR function with a series of sprints. Like our whole process is now a sprint process, which just brings absolute focus and an amazing velocity. And we have somebody that runs it, and it's a 2-week cycle. And what we can get done by focusing on these sprints is amazing. And there are 60 people involved in these sprints, but the things we've gotten done in 4 years because of the way we've gone about it, I'm not actually doing the work. I just brought the idea from venture to say, what if we thought about ourselves instead of being a $70 billion company, we thought of ourselves as 60 of us starting a business that has to do with HR infrastructure and tools, et cetera, et cetera. And it's absolutely taken off like a rocket ship. So that was something, if I had not been in venture, I would have never kind of, thrown that line in the pond and reeled it in.
Example.
I think I'm going to add one thing that I think. So I've been a standing CHRO and served on boards, and it requires a lot of work because you have to constantly balance the, how do I do my day job, but also how do I be independent enough to not take too much of my bias in my day job into the boardroom. However, it's really important to remain relevant and understanding what's happening in the business. So incumbent on you, whether you are in the standing CHRO role or not, trends are super important because they're going to help influence and predict what you need to do for your future. So examples I've seen before, sometimes we'll talk about turnover trends. and retention trends in the boardroom. And very often people are like, well, what are other companies doing? So you can add in some of those trend analysis that one builds credibility for the HR team that's trying to show data to reflect what's happening in their business. But it also helps you sort of say, I've navigated through this, or I know others that have navigated through this, and here's how to think about this. Because I've had a couple board members say, gosh, when you share your experiences, it's really helpful because we've not been through these times before. And honestly, it's been an area of development for me, because sometimes I don't want to be here's what I've done in my past, here's what we should do going forward. But people, they want to hear from us and what we've experienced, so they know that they're not alone in what they're having to focus upon.
For those of you who are retiring, somebody mentioned that. For me, because I've been retired from my corporate job for 7 years, but my consulting business is very vibrant. And that is the piece that I can lean on to talk about being contemporary and being relevant. So just think about that, having something like that if you're going to retire, because you don't want to say, well, I've been retired for 4 years and now it's stale. So that's just something to think about if you set up your LLC or whatever, you know, that could help you stay relevant and kind of keep your hand in, to use that phrase.
Great point.
Follow-up question to that. Someone asked about how boards how they keep themselves prepared for the inevitable crises and instability that happens in the marketplace. Does your consulting firm, Deb, provide board development services? Do you train boards? Do you do any of that? And if so, and any of you, do you use those services?
Yeah, I don't train boards per se. My consultancy is around leadership development in general, diversity, inclusion, and executive coaching. So I wouldn't say it's board specific.
Board focus.
But I do participate with other organizations like NACD, Black Women on Boards, How Women Lead, Women in the Boardroom, et cetera, that have a plethora of training and webinars and all kinds of stuff. All of them got really smart during the pandemic. And like I think Kaye said, I'm very religious about trying to stay up to speed with that, because when I show up in the room, I want to be prepared. I want to be able to contribute in any topic, not just an HR related topic.
The only thing I'll say, Andrea, 2 things. Number one, I encourage boards, and I've taken it upon myself, to really do simulations. Whether that is, because one of my boards, we actually, on Christmas Day, we had a ransomware attack. And because we had done the simulation as a board, we were able to, and again, this is to your point, Deb, we're not operationally focused, but certainly from a governance perspective and the financial impact, because we had gone through that already, we actually were prepared. I've done ESG to make sure, and again, that's part of our role, is to make sure that we are appropriate stewards, and therefore we understand the complexity and the dynamics of what the board is required. And then the last thing I will say is, because I generally, like so many of my colleagues, chair Nom and Gov, I also lead board assessments. So really, we've said the board is a team. Is the board being effective? What are the areas of focus? And as a result of that, how do you get the baseline, and how do you then make sure that you're continuing to evolve and perform effectively as a team? So that's the only other thing I would add.
Well, this was such a riveting discussion. It's hard to believe that the hour is up already, because we could go on for much longer. But on behalf of DHR Global, the Private Directors Association Atlanta chapter, and the SHRM Executive Network, I would like to thank Amy, Deb, Kaye, and Mike for their time and insights. This was so valuable. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended live, and also those who are going to be watching the replay. As a token of our gratitude, we will be sending some materials that will help those of you who are on your board journeys. We know you're busy. We appreciate that you've taken the time to invest in your professional development today. We want you to know that we value you as clients and as individual executives with unique career aspirations as well. Have a phenomenal week and a joyous holiday season. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.